Even 30 minutes before the fighting was wrapping up, immediately inside and or surrounding area of Dolores town itself, by the forces of the 5th PAP Medium Brigade, 3 of its combat battalions striking this area in particular, being its 2 light tank battalions and a mechanized infantry battalion, having moved on the town along with the 2 light tank battalions after overwhelming and crushing border paramilitary forces and customs paramilitary forces at their several border post sites within a 3 by 3 kilometer area upon crossing the border, and also upon the other half of the brigade, 4 battalions, 2 of which went straight for additional paramilitary installations, one being an administrative site, another being a motor pool / armory, and even a brand new heliport built up a gravel road, along with armed civilians helping these embattled paramilitary forces try to fight off the attack. The 4th PAP Artillery Regiment had since fired its final fire missions from Mexican soil from its Type 83 towed howitzers, which were 122 millimeter, 7 firing batteries, and a headquarters battery comprising each battalion of 8 howitzers apiece of the Type 83 towed 122 millimeter howitzer batteries, and also a single Type 59-I or -1 towed 130 millimeter howitzer battalion, configured in likewise the same way as the Type 83 battalions were, packed up their howitzers, hitched them to their field artillery supply trucks, and in tow with their FDC vehicles as well as their command vehicles and logistical vehicles, crossed the border from hour 2.5 or hour 2.5, which was 2:30 a.m., and into the nation, setting up a new firing position at a site that was secured by the south-moving mechanized infantry battalion and support battalion following behind it, as well as 2 mechanized infantry battalions converging on the same area and securing it for the artillery to move in by hour 3.25 or hour 3:15, hours 3.25 into the invasion itself. And upon their setting up, prepared temporary new firing positions, although they didn't have time to set up such elaborate firing positions as they had done on Mexican soil, with foxholes for security on either side of the gun line and ample sandbag emplacements for their howitzers themselves, and instead simply arrayed themselves in a 3-battalion semicircle, with 1 battalion facing to the northeast, 1 facing directly east, and 1 facing to the southeast, to provide artillery support to units operating in the I-35 segment of this battle space, essentially being the 4 battalions that had moved south into the area from having previously engaged and destroyed paramilitary and armed civilian elements miles across the border, as well as now moving on to clear the areas adjacent to the interstate itself, as new croppings up of armed civilians were being discovered as per satellite and drone ISR assets, as well as armed civilians now moving from the recent area that the Mechanized Infantry Battalion and its follow-up support battalion had since overcame and destroyed before having had moved south. This being the small handful of survivors that had ever since been weaving through the countryside, encountering many bewildered and terrified locals who, upon hearing the cacophony and symphony of destruction from all of the ground-based and air-based munitions being dropped by ground attack aircraft, as well as loitering munitions striking predominantly in the Dolores area, including even a cruise missile strike on the heliport of the paramilitary forces of the Americans, as well as the enormous artillery strikes having had occurred in Ranchas, Penitas West, upon these same ISR assets having picked up paramilitary elements and armed civilian elements having converged there after linking up upon having fled the adjacent battle space to the south, being the Laredo battle space, where a far, far larger battle was occurring. The artillery set up in order to support these forces now moving from Hour 3 into Hour 4, cutting off and engaging and destroying these armed civilians, which, like a snowball effect, gathered steam as they slowly and methodically tried to approach I-35, not even fully aware of the fact that I-35 being the prime invasion route in this region, if not the most important invasion route in the entire invasion itself, as it literally went straight into the heartland up through the center of America, was about to be utilized by an enormous 370,000 strong prong of invasion from external forces comprised of Group Armies 7 through 13, as the 10th Group Army out of this invasion prong was starting to wrap up operations in the AO to the south. The PAP had the primary duty within their battle space of likewise clearing areas adjacent to I-35, and this even included Route 255, which began at the border and went all the way directly east towards I-35, which proceeded up in a diagonal direction, having this link up further to the east, as well as Route 83, another important route that likewise also connected to I-35, with half of the PAP's 5th Medium Brigade being tasked solely with clearing this area in their southern portion of their AO by their segment of I-35, along with the 2 battalions of light tank battalions of the 5th Medium Brigade, after having freshly cleared and conquered Dolores, being sent up to 55, primarily to engage and destroy the remnants of the 1st of the 141st Infantry Regiment, which in the opening hour of the invasion was immediately struck within minutes by 2 pairs of Nanchang Q-5 ground attack aircraft flown by PLAAF reserve pilots who struck in an attempt to decapitate the command elements of the unit, their headquarters and logistical battalion, or their headquarters and support, or their, headquarters and support company, their logistical company and command company, which, being equipped with 1,000-pound munitions, 4 per aircraft, very nearly successfully did so entirely, although, fortunately for the Americans, they practiced force dispersion, and this included all of the subordinate companies of the 1st of the 141st being fairly spread out, including the headquarters and command elements within their headquarters and support company. This being a large area of fields and pastures and ranch lands, whereby these forces were encamped in a temporary bivouac area, similar to their brother units of the 72nd Infantry Brigade Combat Team, which were likewise located in the adjacent battle space further to the south. This being the only military unit within this particular battle space of the Dolores and Ranchas Penitas West area, with these forces now hurriedly trying to get into some semblance of a coordinated unit structure, having been, again, previously dispersed and temporarily encamped in the area prior to the invasion's kickoff, the surviving commander, the lieutenant colonel in command overall of the battalion who survived the initial airstrikes, was hurriedly running on foot, giving orders and spreading commands to captains of the companies, along with his XO, who also survived the attack, a major, likewise aiding him in this effort, spreading their orders to form up and organize to flee the area, as to stay in the area would mean certain death, as in absolute terms, as not only had nearly all of their headquarters and support companies' logistical vehicles been totally smashed by the opening airstrikes, but also the commander himself was fully aware that they were being watched by the invaders' ISR assets, including their CH-4A drone, although he wasn't aware of the exact type of ISR assets. The commander was no fool, and this high-flying CH-4A drone was indeed doing just that, monitoring not only the whole battle space, but in many points, putting a key emphasis on monitoring the activities of the 1st of the 141st, which originally, the Trojan unit, the 7th PAP Brigade, which started on the American side of the border near Eagle Pass, and having originally moved down in two prongs, one prong even encapsulating three of its subordinate mechanized infantry battalions with its headquarters and support battalion, along with another prong being strictly mechanized infantry, had since engaged and destroyed 400 armed civilians in a pocket that they surrounded and destroyed before reforming into an entire brigade element and proceeding south, where they were hit by Americans attempting to carry out a guerrilla-like assault, only to completely fend off their assault. And these surviving civilians, a handful of them, did much like had occurred in the south with the survivors from this engagement, whereby their route weaved through the countryside, where they encountered many people who were now outside and confused and bewildered by the invasion and all the thunderous noise occurring throughout the battle space, and as well as there being no communications whatsoever at all, therefore having to pass communication by mouth of what they had just experienced and what they were witnessing to others as they proceeded slowly and methodically through the area. As the 7th PAP Brigade could have easily finished them off, they were ordered on to a far more important target. As the ISR assets monitor the 1st of the 141st Infantry Regiment, this battalion, the only armed forces battalion of the American Armed Forces in this battle space, having already destroyed its forward deployed company during the fighting in Dolores, the PAP forces were set to finish it off, with the 7th PAP Brigade told to proceed onward to cut off any conceivable escape routes in order to prevent it from getting anywhere near Interstate 35 as it proceeded north and slightly to the east of this current battle space, as well as PAP forces from the 5th Medium Brigade, after Hour 3 having since hurriedly moved up 255, completely told to ignore this cropping up group of American armed civilians, approximately 180 of them at this point, as they were seen as they coalesced in this area. They were told to go completely for the intersection of 83 and 255, as this junction of roads was critical to operations in the area, as it was right before the interstate by a sum of some roughly 10 miles. And therefore, they were part of the blocking action in order to prevent the 1st of the 141st Infantry Regiment from getting anywhere near it, as they could pose a potential threat due to their TOW missile systems and other types of heavy weaponry which armed civilians just didn't have. Although, however, the armed civilians were still a nuisance, and a grouping of them had also been sighted at the intersection, as there were ranches and some homes, even a country store and gas station at this particular intersection, and they were spotted preparing themselves for what they knew was now coming. The reason they were fully aware of what was coming is because of the artillery and witnessing the airstrike that had originally occurred at the opening of hostilities, as this was only merely 5 miles away from their position at the fields where the American forces of their National Guard were encamped of the 1st of the 141st. After all, they were so close as it related to this intersection to where these 16 different 1,000-pound munitions were dropped. They felt the rumble of the ground. It was like an earthquake from where they were. And they prepared themselves for a fight, even as the Chi-Com light tank battalions approached with their 4 light companies apiece, 3 armored infantry companies, and 1 headquarters and support company per battalion. At this particular engagement, by the 4th hour, this would be a roughly 45-minute long engagement where one of the 2 battalions would break off 4 of its subordinate companies to engage and destroy these armed civilians at this intersection before proceeding off the road onto a farm road that jutted out slightly to the northwest, whereby they would engage and try to completely finish off the 1st of the 141st, as well as with total close air support coming from the Nanchang Q-5s, which by the point of that engagement will have been armed and equipped to fly their final sorties of this particular battle erupting, as it related to engaging what was perhaps the most single important enemy unit on the entire map to subdue and finish off, as they pose the greatest threat out of all the armed defending elements in this battle space. So by hour 4, these armed civilians had been surrounded and defeated by the 3 combat battalions and support battalion and their subordinate companies breaking off, surrounding and defeating them rapidly, as well as other subordinate companies of these battalions intercepting and crushing this now larger group of approximately 100, being the tiny amount of survivors from this engagement, including the 4 from the very middle and most important section of this battle, as well as some others from the periphery who now had, by this point, acquired additional armed civilians, with their total number being approximately 100, only to be engaged and destroyed by artillery strikes as well as ground-based mechanized infantry forces before they were to move on and clear the rest of the areas adjacent to the interstate. While up here, these armed civilians were beginning to move towards Highway 83, although it would take them some time, considerable time, to get there, as most of them were moving by foot or all-terrain vehicle, and they had roughly 9 miles to travel. As this erupted at hour 4, this fighting at this intersection, 15 minutes into the battle is where this map begins. And by 15 minutes in, multiple things, different events of this combat were occurring on this map. In the south, there was a large ranch property with a drainage ditch that connected to a roadside drainage ditch. There was a destroyed house with a driveway with a grading metal grating that went over the ditch, like is often found in western rural areas. And this was 255 and this was 83, where these routes intersected. Likewise was another home that was destroyed right off the bat from tank shells, as was this one. Also was this country store and parking lot here, gas station right across from this drainage ditch that went up into this ranch property up here in this area. There was a drainage ditch which connected by piping to these and created culverts underneath these roads here where it intersected. We have these holes being the culverts. And this being a grading system here where vehicles could pull off into the gas station and right up to the gas pumps to fuel up. There were other homes here too, which were being engaged at the time of the opening of this map, as well as 2 different airstrikes coming in roughly simultaneously, 15 minutes into the battle, as airstrikes have been called in by this tank company of light tanks onto this fairly large ridge with hills atop of it, where this Q5 swooped down and dropped 2 1,000-pound munitions on this grouping of approximately 20 armed civilians up on this hill, with the rest being fired at by the tank turret gunners, as well as coax, as well as some no tank shells used in this particular area due to the possibility of friendly fire, but mostly by turret gunners and coax machine gunners. These on this hill were fired at as they started to try to levy their fire against these tank forces, although tank shells were used here, but not on this house, as this house was likewise fired at by heavy machine gun and coax, with the rounds tearing through the house and wiping out the armed civilians and pickup trucks on the other side of it, with the tank shells blasting this pickup truck and the shrapnel cutting down these dismounted American armed civilians. While all of this was occurring at roughly the exact same time, these forces, one tank company of light tanks, of Type 62G light tanks, and its headquarters platoon, had stopped at the intersection, with one platoon holding the intersection itself and one behind it to provide protection to their logistical and command element, being their headquarters platoon, while one platoon of their armored infantry committed to this battle, one company of their armored infantry, was here in the southwestern quadrant, along with this tank platoon trying to cut off any sort of escape from the area on 83, along with the other tank platoon in front of them, headed for this ranch property to cut off and help this whole tank company in the very north cordon this area here to be cleared by 2 platoons of armored infantry, one dismounted and one mounted in their IFV and 4 Type 63 APCs, the IFV being a Type 86G, and the APCs being the Type 63 APCs of their armored infantry forces, as their regular mechanized infantry that weren't part of these light tank battalions operated WZ 551 APC and IFV versions in their wheeled armored fighting vehicles. While this battle broke out, again, the airstrikes occurred immediately, 15 minutes in, pummeling the top of this ridge with heavy 1,000-pound munitions. While at this ranch property, the same thing occurred on this hilltop, where these heavy munitions splashed. They eliminated a pickup truck being used as a technical, along with these forces here. And this was right before these light tanks got into position here, as well as there being armed civilian movements as well in this area, as these groupings of armed men were trying to race behind this country store and run across 255 here, some having split into 2 prongs, some going across the grading and into the gas station area trying to take cover behind the building of the gas station, along with others who were right here trying to engage the now dismounted squads from 2 of the 3 armored infantry combat platoons, with the headquarters platoon behind them and further off the map, which were their logistical and support and command elements. In the far north, in the very opening, before this map even begins 15 minutes in, armed civilians were already seen by the platoon-level operated quadcopter recon drones with infrared and night vision capabilities hiding on the hills on the other side of them, many trying to lay in the prone position and hide so that they could hopefully get up and ambush some of these enemy vehicles or troops, only to be seen first and thus eliminated by infantry fighting vehicle fire from the 30mm autocannon, heavy 12.7mm machine guns from turret gunners, be they the tank turrets or the armor personnel carrier turrets or the coax machine guns on the tanks or even on the infantry fighting vehicles, 2 of which leading their respective platoons, one leading this one and one leading this one here in these 2 prongs of advance for these 2 armored infantry platoons, with the other having split up and spread out and moved into this area to the south to cordon any escape to the west for these armed civilians having coalesced on this property. And the other half of the 1 tank company in this area's combat platoons, one being here and one being here, had since moved around by the time that this armored infantry platoon moved into position to engage the large grouping of armed civilians on this particular ranch property here within the confines of the barbed wire fencing within the grazing area, where this part of the drainage system or drainage canal also came up into this property, running perpendicular to this part here, which ran completely adjacent to the 255 road, which these light tank platoons, this one and this one of the same company that this one and this one belong to, were blocking the intersection and providing some support from the road for their armored infantry forces, although they did at first, before these forces moved into position, fire fragmentation and heat shells at these buildings, including these 2 barns and this large barn here and the farmhouse, destroying them completely and eliminating people inside. There were still an ample amount of armed civilians on this hill and lower on this property, many of which in the prone position and hiding behind jagged rock formations coming up out of the desert floor, or pieces of farm equipment, and now others running in to take cover in the rubble as these forces had since rolled into position with these forces, these troops, PAP troops of this squad here, getting into a line formation and firing at the armed American dismounts in this farm property. And they're called dismounts because they're not mounted up in their pickup trucks. These trucks being destroyed immediately at the opening of this map. Again, as in all of the miniature maps of the larger battles occurring, multiple occurrences are happening simultaneously or near simultaneously. The last 30 minutes of this engagement being shown on this map, by which point where these forces begin, they begin 15 minutes into the 45-minute engagement with 30 minutes of the fighting left to go, which showcases the movements of forces as shown. With the whole light tank company of Type 62G light tanks and their support elements of their headquarters platoon cordoning off the north. Initially, while they and an armored infantry platoon on this side of the 2 prongs engaged these armed civilians, eliminating them, having seen them first through drone footage, and that being uploaded on their combat data links to give their exact location to vector their fire at. This house, they started taking fire from in the house and returned fire from turret gunners on their tanks with their heavy 12.7 millimeter machine guns and coax machine guns alongside of their main tank guns, which shredded this house and peppered it full of holes, turning it proverbially into Swiss cheese. And with these rounds flying out the other end of the home, shredding up a pickup truck that had 2 armed civilians within it, one with Molotovs trying to hide in the back, and another with just small arms in the front in the driver's seat, shredding this vehicle into pieces, into a smoking hulk of metal just sitting there, with another one moving into the area from a mile away. This coming from a whole nother ranch further up 83. This group of men from this ranch, there being 3 total within this truck, with 1 in the back with Molotovs and 2 in the front with just small arms, racing towards these vehicles in their respective columns with the intent to get close enough within Molotov range so that the man in the back could at least try to eliminate one vehicle, if nothing else. This was a very desperate war, including even just this engagement here. And in desperate times, desperate people indeed do very desperate things, as had been the case all throughout history, in all wars throughout history. There would be very desperate people trying to carry out desperate last-ditch attacks, whether that was carrying out a kamikaze-like charge for people to get close in enough to throw Molotovs, or whether that was trying to race vehicles to ram nearly into enemy vehicles, or get close enough to within throwing range of these very limited ranged weapons, and many, many, many other types of aggressive combat maneuvers. Very desperate, armed, unprepared civilians would do very desperate things at times during this combat. Upon the massive munitions having been dropped on this hill, eliminating this pickup truck at the base of the hill, along with these armed civilians and the others on the hill and around it, having a large blast radius, as this whole area was a 1 by 1 mile area, the blast radius of these was fairly large. And in this quadrant, eliminated quite a few armed civilians right as these tank forces were about to get into position. The strike wasn't danger close, but it could have been had the attack come in a bit later than it did. With these forces on this ridge having been eliminated and the armor having eliminated these forces, everything in this battle was drone directed, as in all of their reconnaissance, intelligence, and surveillance assets being utilized, or ISR. They fed a steady stream of data to their troops through their combat data links, and even from a central AI system that processed all of it for intelligence analysts to pass down to individual commanders, allowing for the commanders to make even far better decisions, far faster than ever before seen in war. Artificial intelligence was a huge deal in this type of invasion, being that not only was the doctrine of fourth generation warfare a brand new doctrine, which instead of externals crossing borders, shifted to the Trojans taking center stage as they began inside enemy territory and extremely close to all their objectives, with the externals taking a back seat to them. While still important, serving as a heavy-handed reinforcements, they were not the proverbial main star of the show, as were the Trojan shock armies. Although the third component of fourth generation warfare was the introduction of brand new technologies never before used either en masse in war or at all, as many of these were listed in the introductory video of this entire documentary. For brevity's sake, they won't be gone over here. But the AI made reacting to these enemy defending forces far easier and faster than was ever before the case. And the ISR assets allowed them to be seen far easier and faster than ever before was the case, even at the very lowest levels, unlike in previous decades where drones and satellites typically viewed macro areas. Well, now the macro and the micro was viewed, with very small units even having the capability to assist in mapping the battlefield at the lowest levels, such as at the platoon and occasionally the squad level, such as was the case in the PLA. Although not all armies had that capability, the PLA certainly did, being that China was the single largest drone manufacturing nation on the face of the earth. They were more than able to give their regular army drones down at the squad level, being one of few armies to actually be able to do so. With the PAP, not an army, but a parallel military force, meaning it was a parallel or separate army in a way, at least having the capability to do this at the platoon level, which was still at a fairly low level, thereby enabling them to see the battlefield like never before as well. As the light tanks defeated all resistance, shredding through this house with heavy machine gun fire and hitting what was on the other side of it, destroying this house with a tank shell, fragmentation tank shell, destroying these barns, this farmhouse up this driveway here, and these barns and silos with tank shells from these light tanks and these light tanks before they passed here. Whatever remained of these armed civilians were still trying to put up the most vigorous fight that they could, although the PAP were very fast and very brutal with their methods. They were like a form of combat dental floss, really getting in there and sweeping areas of every last single solitary enemy that they could find. On this hill, while these dismounted squads had different objectives upon clearing this quadrant up here, these two squads being tasked with clearing the gas station area and securing this trench line of canals for irrigation/drainage, and this squad solely securing the gas station property from its north. These two squads were tasked with securing this ranch at the northeasternmost edge of this battle space, with the other full platoon still mounted up in their Type 68G and Type 63 APCs. This one platoon had dismounted a squad to control this hill and provide overwatch for their forces operating in the area, and these four to carry out their assigned tasks, as these armed civilians on this hill didn't even get to fire a shot, as they were seen immediately by this platoon's quadcopter recon drone, and thus these forces were able to fire 25 millimeter grenades just over the hill and throw a hand grenade and eliminate these forces before they were even able to pop up and pull the trigger, as they had been laying down at the time in the prone position and were not fast enough in order to react to these squads crouched down and moving very quietly, at first anyways, towards their objectives. As the noise in this battlefield was so loud that the individual infantry troops, while moving, couldn't be heard doing so. And in a matter of seconds, it was too little too late for these armed civilians dispersed on this hill. As they reached the top of the hill and then down the slope of it, these forces began to bound and cover tactically, with these two squads supporting one another, one firing, the other bounding ahead, them stopping, them firing, and them bounding ahead, stopping, firing. They were being engaged from this farmhouse while doing so, and from these elements in and around the gas station, but they laid down heavy small arms fire and even anti-personnel rockets from their Type 69 RPG systems in response, as well as barrel-fired 25mm grenades from their grenade launching systems underneath their QBZ 95 assault rifles, as well as light machine gun fire from their QBJ 201 light machine guns. As at the beginning, again, these running forces were engaged by tank fire from the crew serve weapons on the tank turrets, coax fire, even tank shells at times when it was safe to do so and wouldn't produce a friendly fire incident. Many of these men were wiped out immediately, with the rest making it around the country store and sprinting across the road, jumping either into the ditch and continually running, or running across to the gas station, where they in turn were lit up, as they were also supported by their vehicles by this point, which moved into position here. Fire was being exchanged between both sides, and as a result, there were a few PAP wounded, although the vehicles took almost no damage from the small arms fire, and many who had Molotovs were wiped out before they could even get close enough to throw them, as they were spotted by drone and were therefore the highest priorities as far as defending forces, which needed to be taken care of immediately by the PAP forces operating in this particular battle space. As the exchange of small arms fire continued occurring throughout this battle space, this small 1 by 1 mile battle space, the PAP-2 squads in the north, under the protection of their turret machine gunners acting as a mobile fire support platform from their armored personnel carriers, as well as their heavier, more powerful Type 86G infantry fighting vehicle and its 30mm autocannon, and even possessing two HJ-73C anti-tank missiles on each side, having a rail for one on each side of the turret. The 30mm autocannons were all that was in use here, as these blasting munitions crashed into the ground, with producing shrapnel effects that eliminated two armed civilians trying to hide behind the corner on this side of the house, firing over this low hill upon them standing up and able to be hit, as well as impacting the house as well, eliminating people inside the house trying to take cover and fire from out the windows, while the squad moved into position, bounding and covering with their other squad outflanking the gas station and eliminating its remaining forces. This is all happening after the airstrikes had already occurred at the beginning of the showing of this map. So by this point, when these forces reached this point here, they were firing, and this included their barrel-mounted 25mm grenades into this trench, as well as throwing hand grenades into this area, and also firing small arms, trying to hit those trying to desperately run through this trench system, who are coming around the country store, also being fired at by the lead tanks, coax, and turret gunner, and racing up this trench, by which time, when they emerged from the trenching system, this tank platoon, its lead tank, having already smashed through the barbed wire fencing here upon having eliminated these armed civilians who attempted to hide on this hill and ambush the turret gunners, were firing at those emerging with their heavy machine gun and coax machine gun, as the tank slightly lowered its barrel roughly 10 degrees to engage these forces now beginning to emerge from the very end of the irrigation / drainage trench here on this grazing land, part of the larger ranch property. And upon having eliminated all of them who managed to make it across this street, bounding as fast as they could, and running through this trench system under fire from these dismounted armored infantry forces, and getting out the other end to be engaged by the tank, these forces of this tank platoon now moved up the edges, outer edges of the grazing part of the ranch property along its barbed wire fence that they had just smashed through the southern section of here, leaving one tank down here with the other four spread out all along this path with its lead tank right here at the base of this hill. Now, effectively, this area was completely surrounded nearly at the end of the fighting, with these tanks of this light tank company, these Type 62G light tanks, and the middle being their support vehicles, completely and effectively blocking off the northern part of this intersection battle space, while this whole tank company that had moved and curved around from the south was now blocking off map the eastern end of the intersection area, which was where 259 passed through, with the combination of this whole company blocking this area and this platoon blocking in this area, this whole company blocking the north. The armored infantry forces now continued to clear this whole remaining part of the quadrant, with one squad, the northernmost squad, entering and clearing this entire farmhouse here of this ranch before emerging out the back door, crossing this fence, and going through the barn and clearing it, engaging a few that were inside the barn and eliminating them with small arms fire before clearing the last barn and taking their final position upon having had cleared it before the forces were to leave the area. While all of that was also going on, the fighting in the southwestern quadrant of this battle space was particularly intense, as again, in the initiation of the fighting, before these tanks even stopped here, with the lead platoon stopping literally in the intersection, blocking off the northern end of this whole larger ranch property, and this one behind it providing some protection to its own support elements, which were further away across the road. The armored infantry forces, one platoon of which down here, as this tank platoon moved off to the east of the property, they were heavily engaged in a firefight, which this particular individual firefight did last for roughly the whole 30 minutes, as there were many rock formations on this property jutting up out of the deserty soil. There were pieces of farm equipment and rubble even now, since these barns and buildings had been destroyed by tank shells at the opening of the battle 15 minutes prior to this map being shown, as this battle lasted a total of 45 minutes and this map began 15 minutes into the battle. While all these forces were further to the west, they had long since fired tank shells and annihilated these buildings here, including this house here. By the opening of this battle, these shells impacted these buildings and razed them to the ground. There were still enemy forces alive and running, bounding, and taking cover all throughout this property, including on this hill behind the barbed wire fencing in this grazing area, including in this drainage / irrigation trench, and on the outer edges of the property closer to the road, which they were eliminated by turret and coax machine gun fire, along with the fire from the armored infantry mechanized forces. At the opening, these dismounted PAP infantry forces formed up behind their armor personnel carrier and used it in a rolling shield formation, taking cover behind their what was essentially a rolling armored gun platform, which was firing ahead at this hill. As they were to assist in assaulting the hill, the turret gunner, having already eliminated these armed civilians on the outer edges in tandem with the fire coming from the tanks, the light tanks, the Type 62Gs as they rolled by, with this APC rolling into place, smashing through the barbed wire fencing along with this one. And these infantry dismounts of PAP troops moving in alongside of it, as they were to assist these dismounts, who 5 apiece, half a squad and half a squad, peeled off the back upon the APC reaching right here, with the APC firing ahead, and these 2 half squads, stack team-like elements, essentially a half a squad, 5 and 5, began firing diagonally into this area on top of this hill, where there were roughly 25 armed civilians, and many of which were trying to stay as low as they could and fire back, producing some wounded among the PAP. Although there were no KIAs on the PAP side throughout this engagement. As that was occurring, the turret gunner continued firing in addition to the small arms fire from the dismounted squads. This squad moved ahead and aided in firing against these forces here, with this APC standing by, not firing in order to avoid friendly fire, as it was at the base of the hill at this time, and was just standing by in case it was needed in order to roll up further to take position among the now firing troops, all of which were now laying in the prone themselves, throwing hand grenades and firing small arms, in addition to the turret gunner on this one firing into the hilltop area. As that was going on, the infantry fighting vehicle, the Type 86G, had also smashed through the fence, stopping here temporarily to fire its powerful 30mm autocannon into this area right here with blasting ammunition, HE ammunition, and also firing its 2 HJ-73C anti-tank missiles, producing strong blasting in this area and eliminating a large group of this larger group of armed civilians. Likewise, did this APC also move into position alongside the IFV and continue to provide fire support as these 2 wedge formations of dismounted mechanized infantry moved into position, this one bounding and stopping quickly behind where this trench system began, while this APC rolled up alongside of it to provide it some shielding from their left side, as this did from their right side, while these dismounts jumped into this trench system. Again, these men here had already been eliminated by this point. They jumped into the trench system, while these line formation troops here in a line formation continued to fire across and try to keep the heads down of these armed civilians, many of which hiding behind different rock formations again, and rubble piles that were formerly barns and buildings and silos, and also farm equipment now ripped to shreds, scattered throughout the area. And as this battle was going on, they were attempting, as in this platoon, to do a closing L formation and create a large kill box, which indeed they succeeded in doing. Upon having eliminated these 25 armed civilians right here, the APC and the APC moving over here at the base of the hill, and the full squad that had been with it moving up here, along with the other APC that had stopped here moving into position here alongside of them, and this squad of dismounts likewise moving in. So what you had was 2 squads of dismounts, an APC, the other APC going around and stopping here. So in total, 2 APCs, 2 squads of dismounts firing straight ahead, but vectoring their weapons low so that they wouldn't hit their own forces a bit further off, roughly half a mile away out by the road. So they vectored their fire in a slightly downward arc, while the other forces that had already been right here, the IFV and APC that had been here, the IFV right here, where it has been being engaged, as well as this APC, all these forces being engaged, as the green around the ends of the arrows indicate, continue to provide fire support while these forces moved into their positions here, as well as these dismounts staying in position here, this APC staying in position here so as not to roll in and get trapped in the ditch, and these dismounts in the ditch in a line formation by this point, staying in position themselves, hurling grenades and popping up every so often to provide small arms fire over the edge of the ditch. While even a bit away, roughly from these forces about half a mile away, the turret gunners and coax machine gunners were very careful in providing their support, making sure that the angles and traverse of their weapons was facing a bit down and away from their troops, now at the base of this hill, at the limit of their advance, with a limit of advance being called while these forces were in their formation, with a giant closing L ensuing. And by the time the last of these armed civilians had been eliminated, the infantry fighting vehicle and armor personnel carrier over here moved into position to sweep the area for any potential survivors. As the fighting here wrapped up, very heavy, savage fighting. Again, there were some PAP wounded, as this was a fairly intense sub-component of the much larger battle, being that it was over a vital intersection as it pertained to I-35, which itself ran diagonal to this area and connected to 83, to the Route 83 in the south, and to 255 to the east of this intersection. Therefore, having had secured the intersection, the PAP forces themselves prepared to rendezvous with the rest of their battalion and their other light tank battalion itself, which the two battalions, upon completely reforming themselves up into formations, as far as one battalion coming together and the other along with that one, would prepare to carry out their main assault on the 1st of the 141st Infantry Regiment. As this engagement, as it was now nearly hour number 5 into the invasion, this engagement would occur by hour number 6. By hour number 5, ample activity had also been occurring in the south, as by the end of hour 4, these two armed civilian elements had been engaged and destroyed, with the forces of 4 different battalions, the support battalion and 3 mechanized infantry battalions moving up I-35 to continue their operation of clearing the adjacent areas to the highway, surrounding and destroying another 200 civilian pockets, similar to what had occurred here, only this grouping was far less better prepared and was easily dispatched before they prepared to move up 83 to clear its southernmost portions between the intersection battle that occurred and the interstate of I-35, as that was their given task to complete the operations within their AO adjacent I-35 and its clearance, as they were preparing to intercept this grouping of armed civilians that had been earlier spotted a few hours before making its way to 83. So therefore they had to try to prevent this, as they could possibly go further to the south, or even conceivably moving further to the east. Although some would make it and get away alive, it would be comparatively very few as it related to their original number of roughly what would become 200 by the time they reached here, as it was a bit under 200 when they initially formed up as a grouping of ranchers and locals. As the 7th PAP, now moving as a full brigade, essentially crushed a prepared ambush against them and now proceeded on their primary directive to cut off any means of retreat insofar as a direction of retreat for the 1st of the 141st. They moved again off map, as they had begun off map up near Eagle Pass on their CCP properties. They moved slightly off map to move towards 83 further off the map to therefore cut off any potential escape by the 1st of the 141st Infantry Regiment, that remains of that battalion, into that area, while the commands had changed for the elements of the 5th Medium Brigade to go ahead and engage and destroy the 1st of the 141st, as by now the Q5s of the entire Q5 squadron, including those who carried out the airstrikes 15 minutes into the battle at the intersection, were now doing an RTB, or return to base, to all be loaded with 4 1,000-pound laser-guided munitions apiece in order to conduct close air support, specifically in support of the PAP light tank battalions, whose role would be now to finish off the only military unit that was even in the battle space, the 1st of the 141st, as they had already engaged and destroyed one of its subordinate companies in the earlier fighting in Dolores itself, and now would be engaging the remaining 3 and roughly 1/2 companies of it, if you include the remaining surviving personnel from the initial airstrikes of about 50 from its headquarters company, which originally had 120 members. Only due to the fact that they were so well dispersed is the only reason why even 50 of them survived that initial punishing airstrike. But now, as these forces gather together and into a cohesive, organized formation and prepared to leave the area, they moved slightly north, only to run into armed civilians likewise fleeing the area, having had encountered the 7th PAP in its full brigade strength and badly been mauled in the fighting, as well as picking up the survivors of that initial encounter, picking up many armed civilians along the way. They met up with the 1st of the 141st and decided to convoy, hopefully out of the area alive, together as a unified element. Although this was not to be, as disaster was set to unfold by the final hour of battle within this battle space of Dolores and Ranchas Penitas West. As in the final hour of this battle, the PAP would consolidate control over I-35 within its specific battle space in this area, in this sector, as well as crush the final remaining elements trying to resist the invasion within this sector, most of which at this point just trying to flee the area alive as it pertained to the defenders, as large numbers of them were badly mauled in the opening hours of the invasion itself as a whole, as the fighting, even in the first 4 hours, had shown to be quite disastrous for the defenders as a whole. However, it could be said that as this area had once been a mining-oriented area as it related to coal reserves that were now used up, there were ample numbers of coal mines, or former coal mines, that now were essentially man-made cave complexes And although the PAP was well aware of these types of areas, as their intelligence spanned not just units and their size and capabilities of the enemy, but also of entire areas and regions, they were well aware of the existence of these mines, but for the time being, and wrote them off as essentially being unimportant, as they were more concerned with speed and ferocity of their assaults against the defending forces. In a sense, they were trying to eliminate all the defending forces, not even giving them a chance to use these cave complexes for any type of shelter or respite. Although such choices would, during the occupation of the nation, come back and cause a thorn in their side after the invasion phase had concluded and they were victorious over America. There would be a phase where conquest and occupation would turn into a large campaign of counterinsurgency. And the insurgents or partisans would indeed, at least in this area along the border, be using these old mines as shelters for their respective partisan elements. But that, as it can be said, is another story for another day. The Battle of Dolores and Ranchas Penitas West will conclude in the next video, followed by yet another battle of the larger Texas / South Central campaign of the whole invasion as a whole, with the following video being the last on this particular battle involving the 1st of the 141st Infantry Regiment and its ultimate destruction, along with a hefty grouping of armed civilians now rushing to join them in a retreat out of this area, which so far is a quasi-organized voluntary withdrawal, but later turns into a rout by hour number 6 of the invasion.